understand, the chasm that we often talk about between India and the rest of the country in the Northeast is fairly huge. In 1989, as a young college student, I was on my first visit to the Northeast. I was working for a chartered accountancy firm based in Calcutta while I was still doing my BCom. And I managed to wrangle a visit to Assam for about 3 weeks as part of an audit that was to be done with 2 large tea gardens. And that was my first experience as a 19-year-old of what the Northeast was really about. Beautiful, on the Bhutan border, where you got a sense of the snow-capped mountains and beautiful, lush tea estates and some lovely people. I actually fell in love with that place and thought I'd make a career in, and join the tea estates. But my host, I was staying with, I remember the assistant manager in the tea estate, and he and his family were absolutely shocked to hear that a 19-year-old was about to kind of embark on what they thought was the worst mistake in his young, fledgling career. They said absolutely not, and I got a sense of the other side, because in 1987, that was the time when I think the Boer agitation was at its peak. And in that 3-week period, I remember there must have been at least 3 or 4, 48-hour strikes, which would entirely paralyze the town where we were. And you could sense the undercurrent of tension, insurgency, a lot of things that were clearly palpable, the tension and the paralysis that was about to kind of set in. Obviously, the Northeast has had its own share of, challenges. Today, in today's session, we try and kind of understand that, because I think the Northeast in some ways represents an experiment. An experiment, when we talk about India's unity in diversity, I think there's nothing better than the entire canvas that the Northeast offers, the 7 sisters, as they call it, the 7 states that make up the Northeast. And we're still, I think, in many ways, grappling with the challenges of kind of assimilation, of bringing them closer to the mainland, as it were, and even at a very basic level to try and understand them better. And I don't think we've got a fantastic opportunity to do that today, because the gentlemen who kind of part of this panel have spent considerable amount of time researching that theme from 2 very different lenses. Mr. Balagopal, as you would have heard, served there as a district official and was privy to, in the early days of towards the late 70s, for a few years when he spent time in Manipur, got a sense of what those challenges of governance really were. Sudeep, as a very, very senior journalist, has had, I think, the opportunity to, kind of do a much more contemporary study of the problem from his lens of internal security, strategic affairs, governance, and the political challenges of that the Northeast faces. And he's kind of traveled widely and spoken to people across the whole the strata of society. So we've got 2 very interesting perspectives of the past that Mr. Balagopal in some ways represents, and he's, I'm sure, kept in touch, and Sudeep from his. But I'd like to kind of start by asking Mr. Balagopal. Mr. Balagopal, you chose to write this book at many years after you served as a district official in the IAS. What prompted you to kind of go back to that period, which was an early part of your career after which you became an entrepreneur? What made you go back to and write about your experience in the Northeast? What were you hoping to achieve?
The honest answer is actually I used to keep in the evening sometimes talking with friends, narrate episodes and anecdotes from the past, especially, and most of them related to my time in the Northeast because it was a wonderful time, and it appeared very strange and exotic to the company in which I usually found myself in. And so my wife one day told me that, see, these are so interesting, and they're so, people want to know so much about it, why don't you write them down? So anyway, I treated with sort of very lightly. But the more I thought about it, and when I got in touch with my friends and batchmates who continued to be in the service, I realized in a way, while many things had changed in the Northeast, unfortunately many things had not changed. And some of those things which should have changed had not changed. Like the attitude towards the Northeast, the aware of the Northeast, the interest and the thinking resources, analytical resources which should have been brought to bear on the problems of the Northeast. Those had not changed at all. So when I thought here is something, if I put down an anecdotal account of those times, maybe there would be a resonance in today.
Right.
And of course, I did make a conscious effort to try to keep the knowledge of subsequent events from creeping into the narrative, because that's so easy to now appear very wise about many things which one never suspected in those days. So by treating it at the anecdotal level, I've tried to prevent that from coming in, and I don't know to what extent I've succeeded. That ultimately the readers will have to judge that part of it. But that was the reason. I felt that, and as you said, Indrajit, I felt that the Northeast actually, far from being a very remote and exotic part of India, is actually a microcosm of India.
That's right.
And it represents some of the most intractable issues which are going to be challenges for administration and governance in India, like the issue of identity and the issue of nationhood.
Yeah, we'll get into
those kind of things.
We'll explore that, but certainly, understanding our past gives us some perspective, and I'm sure Ms. Balagopal's endeavor will help us. Sudeep, why the Northeast? What fascinated you?
Well, before I get to that, just a quick disclosure. I share with Mr. Balagopal, he's confessed it in the book, so I'm not giving you a state secret, but besides the subject of allocation in the Northeast, we also share the name of our romantic interests. They happen to be exactly the same. We spell it differently. So I'm quite grateful to that. That's quite a coincidence, as it is. And that is about the only joke I'm going to crack in the next 5 minutes, because I expect to make you a little indignant, and I hope a little upset as well. Maybe as upset as I was when I chose to look at issues of conflict in India. Like all of us, or many of us, or most of us over here, I grew up on a diet of how everything was very good, everything was very perfect, and how ours was a great nation, and I believe it is a very great nation. However, I think the time that I was growing up, a lot earlier than you, ladies and gentlemen, or most of you, ladies and gentlemen, the two of you seem to be contemporaries, is that I think it happened when, in the 60s and 70s, when we were still a very young country, and I think in the construction of a nation, everything has to be made to look good, even better than it is, because after all, that is then the idea of India. But I think as I grew older, as I became more exposed to the politics and the economics and the development issues and the national issues of India, I found that we had actually been excluding vast areas of our country. And by that exclusion in politics and history, for example, I read right through school and university, I'm a student of history, I did not read a word in my Indian history chapters, anything about the Northeast, not one word. I read about the Gangetic Plain, the other great river in India, among other rivers. The Brahmaputra was just a name. I knew nothing about the plains of the Brahmaputra, or where the Brahmaputra came and went. It was as if east of Calcutta, or Kolkata as we call it now, nothing existed. East of Kolkata was, those Bengalis, and as in Bangladesh, or those Pakistanis. That's really what it was. And then, those Chinky people. That's really where it stood. I think that was a gross reality. It continues to be in many ways a gross reality, where by dint of policy, by dint of arrogance, I think an arrogance of power, an arrogance of nation building in a way, we sort of, I think we just ignored 1/7 of our landmass, and today it counts about 50 million people. These are not small sums. What it did do is I think that it also, I mean, I realized it as I went to university, when I interacted with people from the Northeast, and I couldn't understand why they were so angry. Many of them were so upset about people from the place that they call mainland India. They don't say India, they say mainland India. And for us, it is the Northeast. It's not quite north, I think it is our far east. So I think some of Mr. Balagopal's colleagues would have got promoted by coming up with the name Northeast, you know. Sorry, just kidding. We've done and dusted there. Sorry, that's the second joke. And that struck me. Then why don't I look deeper into the issues that make my friends so upset with how things are? Because I think that I'm this member of this energetic, aspirational, ambitious nation, Republic of India. And I'm a card-carrying member of it. But why are people from a large landmass that we claim to be our own so upset with the rest of the country? Its history, its attitudes, its policies. So I started getting curious. That was one main reason. The second key reason is that I started looking deeper into the histories, therefore. And then not very many histories seemed palatable. Mr. Balagopal, during his tenure in Manipur, would have encountered many such attitudes, I'm sure, in his administrative duties, while fulfilling his administrative duties, where the idea of India would have been a very distant thing. And in fact, I love the title of his book, On a Clear Day You Can See India. I think that is symptomatic of, in a way, how near and yet how far it could be. And I started exploring reasons of alienation, and I'd like to talk about it later on, and I'll keep it concise right now, is that I think the problem began in many ways with partition. You know, I can blame Mr. Nehru for his paranoid reaction against Nagaland or the Naga army, where he sent people, the Indian army in to basically, in effect, beat, torture, maim, rape, burn, kill the people. And I found that very gross in the sense that I was wondering if we wanted to include people and tell them that you wanted to be a part of the nation, to be a part of India, to do these things to them was not quite the way to do it. I mean, if you were to conclude people, if you wanted to make people your own, surely you needed to listen to them. Surely you needed to, if they said, we are a different people, we have our own aspirations, then surely you needed to listen to them before you reacted to them. So I started thinking maybe that paranoid reaction came because we came out of a very bloody partition. And there was a lot of paranoid reaction in New Delhi. The government of India perhaps didn't want to lose any more territory, didn't even want to consider the ceding of territory, because we'd lost so much in territory, in our idea, in our history, and in blood. Millions had died in partition. So I started exploring these aspects. And then the third thing that drove me to write this book is that we seem to be consumed in many ways with the geopolitical sweet spot that Jammu and Kashmir is located in. For instance, that we seem to think that the world revolves around our ambition and around this tri-junction, which includes India, Pakistan, the disputed territories of Kashmir, both in what we call POK and in our part of Kashmir, and the abutting territory of China. But we seem to forget what the Northeast is adjacent to. If you look at the map, you will find Northeast has its neighbor, Nepal, and I'm adding Sikkim as the eighth sister.
Sure.
Sikkim came on board a little later when we annexed it. Sorry if I'm sounding politically incorrect. But I'm already declared an enemy of the state, so that's okay. Sorry, kidding. Nepal, the Tibetan Autonomous Region that we've acknowledged that now belongs to China. China, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar. Now, if you're talking about a geopolitical sweet spot, what gets sweeter than this? All right? I mean, and I said we're talking about the look east policy. We're talking about hydrocarbon in Brazil. We're talking about regional security. We're talking about regional trade, commerce, investments, all manner of things. How can you ignore the Northeast? So I started looking at the Northeast also from this perspective, saying, okay, it's got alienation, it's got problems of dignity, you've got the problem of constitutional crisis. It has raging conflicts in several states, which is still, and in a couple of states they are still ongoing. But what about the future? What are people there thinking about now? How do they see themselves? How do they see India? So the book that I wrote about is not for the people in the Northeast. They know exactly who they are. It's for people like you. So this is my attempt to try and bring stories from there to here, from the Northeast to the so-called mainland, from what I call outland to what I would call inland, where we all are.
Fantastic. I think, Sudeep, you've set the context beautifully. I kind of dive into the whole issue of the point that Sudeep made about the whole idea of India and local aspirations and the whole sense of, or the sense of identity that in some ways lies at the core of what we're discussing. How did you find that as in your kind of stint as a district administrator, and how was that such a polarizing, kind of force?
I think it's important to see the place as, through my eyes when I went in there first.
Sure.
So this was 1978, and here I am, a Mallu from the deep south, suddenly posted to this place called Manipur, which we know where it is on the map, and we land up there with very few, say, preconceptions, maybe some misconceptions, and but very little idea, because there was hardly any books on the Northeast, and whatever few books were there were written before the 1930s by Englishmen who served there. So we land up there. So this whole thing about identity and that it is such a huge issue, there was something. And here, whatever I say, Indrajit and the ladies and gentlemen, is experiential. I'm not a scholar of the Northeast, so I have really read very little about the place and the history and the traditions, etc. I'm not done too much by way of studies. Mostly it's experiential, what I actually saw. So when we went in there, I realized that even what I thought were, say for instance, like Naga, Mizo, etc., were actually very broad terms. And within Naga you had, Ao, Angami, and so many different Tangkul, etc. And within that there were differences. Between, say, two villages, they could easily identify, depending on the accent, on the dialect, they could say which village they were from. Are you from Somdal? Are you from Hundung? Are you from Toloi? They could easily make those things out. So this was something incredible and sort of exotic the first time I went there. So this, very soon from a job perspective, this element was replaced by the fact that I realized that we have a huge problem. Now how do we deal with this issue of identity? Because here again, I'm not talking about the context of the Northeast vis-a-vis mainland. Here within the Northeast itself, as a district official, we were faced with issues like, for instance, the issue of identity had been sliced so thinly in the Northeast that it had reached a logical, sort of logically absurd limit. You couldn't go any further. You couldn't slice a village up further. And a village was about 100 houses. That's all. So, for instance, if there were disputes, the first questions which we asked whoever brought us the information was, who were the two parties involved? Were they both from the same tribe or were they from different tribes? If they were from within the same tribe, we said, okay, then it's a much smaller matter, we can sort it out. If they were different tribes, immediately the antenna went up saying. So it's like in the rest of the country, in say parts of Muzaffarnagar, I guess, because today, or many other parts of India, if there's a dispute, the district administration first wants to know, are there two different communities involved? So I think our administration since 1947, while you may ascribe many failures to it, one thing is that they have become very, very sensitive to these kind of issues at the district level. Now the problem happens is that this sensitivity which has been developed and which has been finely honed in some parts of the country in the district administration, this somehow it doesn't feed back up into the decision-making levels in government, and which is where most of the failures of governance come, according to me. Many of the issues are understood well at the district level, but by the time the information percolates to the state capitals and the national capital, and decisions are taken and on which actions are implemented on the ground, something happens there. So identity as a real issue is something which we saw and we encountered every day in a very meaningful.
Why couldn't it be tackled in a sensible manner?
So actually that leads us to another issue, in which I think probably will become a thing, which is that I believe that political processes and the democratic political process are supposed to provide a means for understanding these differences and reconciling these differences. Now somehow those kind of conversations don't seem to be happening. And we don't seem to be creating spaces and platforms to enable such conversations to happen. So, and this must be again seen in the backdrop of, say, for instance, politics. I mean, which from my perspective at least seems to, in the last, say, 50 years, you see, what seems to have happened is ideology seems to have sort of vacated the space and been replaced by all kinds of other things which have come in.
Sure.
And the easiest thing for the politicians to grab at when they're at a loss for ideas is identity,
right,
which is right there in front of them.
Right. So, just kind of delving a little deeper into this whole issue of identity and the point he was making about how politicians and the political system may have kind of used it to whip up differences rather than kind of unify people. What did you find from your conversations there?
Well, I found something quite similar, and in fact, we have sort of, when I'm saying we, I mean, here I'm presuming to speak as the state of India, the government of India, and the political practices of the Republic of India. I think we've exported the very worst impulses and tendencies of our politics and political economy and administration to the Northeast, to the great irony, and I'll address this in a little detail, in some detail, in half a minute, is that I think that, and let me begin this assertion by stating that I believe that today the government of India, in many, many ways, is no longer the sole issue in the northeast of India. It is the northeast of India that is also a tremendous factor. The people who govern the northeastern states, the chief ministers, the implicit bureaucracy, the local politics, the local identity issues, are as much an impediment in many ways as the government of India has been so long seen to be from the time of India's independence. Having said that, and that's a slightly radical statement, sometimes politically correct, sometimes I hope politically incorrect. The fact is that the political system and the administrative system, alas, and the security system, because India's security establishment has a vested interest in the Northeast. I believe that they tend more to the economy of conflict than the economy of peace. It is worth their while, in a way, to not have conflict resolved in this area. And I've heard this from army people and from police, saying we get several billion rupees more in budgets if the conflict festers for a little longer. And this is a very cynical statement, but it's true. The point I'm trying to make is that, as Mr. Balagopal was saying, that the microcosm of India in many ways is reflected in the Northeast. I believe that even the baser instincts of the Republic of India in its microcosm are reflected in the Northeast, where now many local politicians in Manipur is a grand example of it. And Nagaland is another example of it. Assam is a fine example of how conflict resolution is delayed, even though you might hear words about how the government of Assam is now talking to various militant groups. These three, Meghalaya to some extent, these states are emblematic of how people in the Northeast are now become part of this very corrupted system of government and administration, and they're feeding conflict there. They're not letting conflict be resolved because it is in their interest to not do so. I personally believe that makes us get into a slightly tricky situation, where tribe is put against tribe, where ethnic groups are pitted against ethnic groups. And I hope to share with you some aspects from the book, and I'm sure Mr. Balagopal will as well, where we can share some insights from our books with you, as some impressions that we can bring to share with you. If you don't mind, this may be a good opportunity to read a little section from my book, where, and a lot of the book is about how the people in the Northeast view India. And I haven't yet gone to jail for this blurb at the back, which speaks very well for our democracy. There's a Naga gentleman who says, "Do you want an honest answer? I don't consider myself an Indian." But that is not what I'm going to read to you. I'm going to read to you a little chapter from how, say, in this particular reading, is how the Naga people are upset and tired to death, literally, of the Nagas fighting the Nagas. So I was in a few years ago as part of my research for the book, where I walked into this completely ironical situation where a group called the Naga Mothers Ho Ho, which is basically the apex organization of the women's organizations of several tribes. There are 16 major Naga tribes, several minor ones, and the Naga Mothers Ho Ho, which is a word that says, it's the apex organization, had taken out a procession because the two major Naga rebel groups, the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, Isaac Muiva, and the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, of the Kaplan faction, were fighting and killing each other in not just fives and tens, but in scores. And I walked into this situation where the society, the civil society, were bemoaning the fact that we've gone from taking on the government of India, our patriotic fight for our identity that we've had for so long since the early 1950s, has now escalated, has now demeaned itself by the Nagas fighting the Nagas. Imagine that, and that's where we've come. And that is why I prefaced my comment with what I had said. So this is a reading where I'm in Dimapur. This is from a few years ago. If you'll permit me a short reading. And I'm through a little bit of the despondency as well as the aspiration of the people. There it is to my left, Difupar Gate at the 4th mile, soon after the turn to Dimapur's tiny airport and Nagaland's only one, nestled between the highway and the hills. On a summer night the previous year, 10th May 2008, here at Difupar Gate, I had watched several thousand women from numerous Naga tribes, sickened to their hearts with bloodshed from Naga killing Naga, gather for a torchlight rally. Many carried candles, but most carried staves of green bamboo split at one end to hold small containers of oil feeding the flames of protest. Traffic was at a standstill. This stretch of Highway 39 belonged to the ladies. They're at the call of the Naga Mothers Ho Ho, or Apex Association, of the Dimapur area. I had walked into the charged throng, and the ladies, young and old, allowed me, an obvious stranger. Two middle-aged women stood on an open-top truck by a building that advertised the Nagaland Muay Thai Institute. The ladies were positioned behind a couple of microphones on stands, connected to a battered amplifier, and further to two large loudspeakers fixed on the top of the driver's cab, the ensemble powered by a car battery. I had walked in mid-speech. A stout lady with glasses was speaking in a mixture of Nagamese, which is sort of a bazaar Assamese, which actually linguistically unites the Nagas, because many of them can't speak each other's languages. So Nagamese, in a way, is the lingua franca. Quite similar to Assamese, but not so. Anyway, I had walked in mid-speech. A stout lady with glasses was speaking in a mixture of Nagamese and English. Ekta request koribo. She spoke in a strong voice over the crowd that stood in respectful silence. And then she raised her pitch. Stop this killing! Stop this fighting! She turned her anger on the Naga rebel factions, taunting them to kill her if they wished. Aruki koribe, amake maribe. That brought a wave of laughter, but it was quickly stilled. Her voice seemed amplified in the ensuing silence. If you love your brother and sister, father and mother, son and daughter, stop this fighting! Stop this killing! People around me had begun to wipe their eyes. I stood, transfixed. She spoke of how the next day would be celebrated everywhere as Mother's Day. Only Dimapur and Nahoy, she said. Nagaland and Nahoy. Whole world Nahoy. Means it's Mother's Day all over the world. It is up to us mothers to talk peace, she said. We will have to go door to door. How many more children will we give birth to? Her voice dropped to a choked whisper that speakers carried to every ear and every heart in the gathering, to see them die. She started to cry, and we cried with her. Then it was time for prayer. The second lady on the truck led the crowd, first in Nagamese and then English. Dear Lord, she intoned, and the ladies repeated after her. Take away our garment of fear, give us your garment of peace and hope. I looked around. The ladies had their eyes closed in prayer. Some covered their eyes. A few shook with sobs. We pray to you. We give ourselves unto you. In Jesus' name, amen. They marched on slowly towards St. Anne's Church down the road for a few minutes of silent prayer. And I watched it flow, this river of light. So this is just an indication of how, I think, to me, it moves me a lot. And I've seen this in Nagaland, I've seen this in Manipur, I've seen this in various tribal areas in the northeast, in Assam, where there is a fatigue to combat, there is a fatigue to conflict. I mean, that even a fatigue that the so-called righteous wars that were being fought to protect your dignity and identity, and so many good causes, grand causes, to the extent that sometimes rebels are described as national workers, had over time been so corrupted that they themselves had become questionable. And that together, the government of India, or the agencies of the government of India, or the administration and the politics of India, which has now sort of bled almost seamlessly into the Northeast, and then infected in a way the Northeast, and has been adopted by the people of the Northeast, those who rule them, those who govern them, have reached at a point where it seems like even for people who so badly want a future, there is none. Imagine that feeling of despondency. And to me, this just sums up saying, enough, we want to move on. You know? And that's really, I think, lies at the nub of the Northeast. That this is a region that so badly wants to move on, so badly wants conflict to end. And I think the government of India and the governments of these various states and the people of these various states, and many of us who choose to be ignorant of what's going on there, I think all of us contribute in our own ways to ensure that the conflict persists and the conflict is not resolved. I'll stop there.
Very strong poignant words. Balagopal,
Can I just,
yeah, sure. In fact, I'd like you to respond.
You know, I had the, through, I'd say, accident of history, to be in the Northeast at a time when some of the fateful things happened there. Now, you know, for instance, most of us have heard of the Assam students' agitation, which in fact brought down governments, made the Northeast, made Assam very difficult to govern, till finally the central government was forced to listen to what the AASU and others were talking about, etc. And it brought about a sea change in the way Assam was governed itself. But I remember the whole thing started actually around 1978-79, when the revision of the electoral rolls was happening. As junior district officials, part of the election process is revising the electoral rolls before a general election. You know, when people can ask for inclusion, if their names are not in the electoral rolls, they will put in applications for that. So I actually recount in my book, there is one of the anecdotes is about a revision of the electoral rolls, and I've titled it, "The Foreigners Are Coming." That's the title of that. But of course, the whole tone of my book is, in terms of, it's a little more light-hearted, though the issues are pretty serious. But that's the way I am. I generally take a slightly light-hearted view of things. So at that time, we found ourselves faced with this problem. In Manipur, most of the objections, at least in the district where I was serving, was that the local people were saying that these are not from Manipur, they are Nepalis, and they have come in and they are not actually Indian citizens, etc. Now my counterparts, my batchmates in Assam, were facing the same problem when they were doing the revision of the electoral rolls. Point which I want to say is, see, when we make broad brush statements about governance, those statements must be carefully understood because they apply differently at different levels of governance. As I mentioned earlier, there are many things which are happening in terms of capturing and a good understanding of what is the situation on the ground at a certain level. Now, what they do with that information is part of the problem as it filters up to the higher levels. My batchmates, at that time as trainees, we had a sandwich training program. First, we spent a year in Mussoorie, then we went for 9 months to the state of allotment, and then we came back for 3 months for the sandwich part of the program, when we are supposed to recapitulate whatever we learned, what we saw in the district, etc. My colleagues from Assam presented a their district experience case study was prescient, was like a foretelling of what was going to happen. Nobody listened to them. I think the senior office, they were laughed out of the room.
Why?
Because people said you're seeing very huge problems where none exist. You guys, experience, what they were said was, you are saying you're getting alarmed about all these things because you're inexperienced, because you don't know, in inverted commas, and then after some time you'll figure out that you need not get excited because of some shadow under a bush or under a tree thing. So in other words, the very important intelligence obtained by observing situations and facing situations on the ground was neglected, was ignored. And finally, when it blew up into a situation which, it became the whole of Assam, the whole of the northeast ground to a standstill, only then the government listened. So, here is a case of that, if you go down to and I suspect in many parts of the country where insurgencies of different kinds, dissatisfactions of people of different kinds are bottled up and burst forth, you will find there are reports at the district administration level which have reported all these things, which have captured from the Sarita Nagpal and the sand mining, in the rivers, etc. These situations, these issues are being captured there at the district administration level. But, it's true. Something happens.
So clearly you're making a clear case for a far more decentralized governance model that perhaps still remains work in progress, even after so many years.
In fact, Indrajit, I have a view that, the more and more I see of what's happening, across the country, and the kind of colossal misgovernance happening at the center and at the states. I think they vie with each other as to who can misgovern more or worse or whatever it is. Plumb to greater depths of misgovernance. But I sometimes ask myself, such a huge and complex country like 65 plus years later is still a functioning entity. And I ask myself, what is, and so we hear all kinds of reasons about the ancient, the ancient idea of India, and etc., etc., etc. I have a view that probably the answer is to be found in a very more prosaic thing, which is India consists of 640 districts. In the district administration, whatever happens in the distant state capital or national capital is of very little consequence, frankly, on a day-to-day basis at a district administration. The district magistrate, the district superintendent of police, the district educational officer, the district industries officer, the district panchayat officer, all of them continue their quotidian tasks on a day-to-day basis. 95% of the citizens of this country, their contact with government is with the district administration. And somehow, it's like the autonomous or parasympathetic nervous system of the human body. It goes on without need for any central, instruction or direction coming from the brain. And thank God for that, because the brain is anyway brain dead. So, but the system continues to function.
Right. You want to kind of read a small chapter from your book that you'd like to kind of pick out and share?
This is actually, I must say, please forgive the light-hearted tone. But let it not be misunderstood for that the issues are being trivialized. They are not. This is on page 49. Here I describe the title is The Courtesy Call. When you first go as a district official and you first take charge, across India, a ritual is that all the other functionaries will come and call on you. They'll come and say, they'll introduce themselves. And of course, the interminable cups of tea and many plates of biscuits and all that will have to be served out, as you understand. And then it will be a procession of various kind of acronyms. That somebody will say, I'm from the SFDA, I'm the BDO, I'm this, I'm that. In those days, I was completely dazzled by all these things. So various people are coming and going. In this episode, one of the people who comes in, he sits down and he introduces himself. He says, I'm so-and-so. It didn't register because everybody was saying some name, something or the other. This was the nth person coming in that day. And he left it, he proffered his card. So I took the card and I looked at it, and it was, a name was there and it was written SDO Ukrul. I felt that was curious because I was the SDO Ukrul. So I said, that's funny because I am the SDO Ukrul too. And then he grinned and said, oh, I'm with the underground. So I thought he's joking. First I thought he's joking, and I said, okay, that means I think people have a sense of humor here, that's good. Then I realized he's serious. Because then I looked at the card again, it was written Revolutionary Government of Manipur or something. And so then I was wondering, now nothing in my Masuri training had equipped me for this situation, so I didn't know, what do I do now? Do I press the bell and call the police and have, or do I leap across a table and wrestle this guy to the ground and call for help? What do I do, And while I was having all these existential doubts, my head clerk walked in, greeted the man who was seated opposite me, and went across, took a file and went back. So obviously he knew him, So here I'm just, trying to recount what all went on in my mind. My hand still, because we were shaking hands, my hand still in his, I thought wildly that I was imagining the whole thing. The RGM was the acronym for the underground movement that was fighting a low-intensity guerrilla campaign against the government. With nothing to say, I had little option but to continue, let my hand be shaken, trying at the same time to extricate it from the man's grip. He looked happy, with the air of a man who had got through the difficult but necessary task of introductions, and appeared ready and willing to move on to the next stage in the proceedings. Should I offer him a cup of tea? Why not? And anyway, I don't know how to handle the situation, at least not yet. Is he really a member of the underground? He looks a decent sort of chap, quite normal in appearance. But a terrorist? Are all members of underground movements terrorists? The semantic aspects of this issue appeared to be a promising line of thought. But then another thought intruded. What should a terrorist look like? With a Zapata moustache and bandoliers of ammunition strung across his chest? Had I seen any pictures of terrorists or members of the underground? What did they look like? I realized I must have glanced over hundreds of pictures of guerrilla fighters and terrorists dead and alive in Time magazine and in life, but couldn't recollect what their faces looked like. My opposite number, and in brackets I write, I had already started to think of him as a functionary or as an official, was happy to accept the offer of tea, which we sipped in congenial silence as I searched for something to say. He prattled on about the good points of the district and offered helpful tips on what to do and where to go and what to see. The chap was actually being quite nice, and there I was wondering about what terrorists look like. Should I be sitting here talking to a self-proclaimed member of the underground? Am I not supposed to call for the police to arrest him and clap him in irons? To make him rot in jail so that the constitutional government could go about its work and the free citizens of Ukrul about theirs? Is my behavior not treasonous, inviting dire consequences, the least of which would be dismissal from service? These and other thoughts bubbled and frothed in the cauldron that my mind had become as I tried vainly to follow his tips on how to make the best of my tenure in Ukrur. Then he goes on, and then he finally says one little bit, which he talks about the Tankuls, because he was from Ukrur. We Tankuls are an interesting lot, and too clever by half. We are always quarreling and appear to have an inexhaustible store of issues over which to fight. On a more serious note, Tankul youth have taken to education faster than any of the other hill tribes, and as a result, many of our people have made it to the IAS and higher services. Our young people study in the best universities in India and go on to seek careers in various fields. We are part of the Naga nation, but the other major Naga tribes like the Ao and Angami fear and respect us. Although there has been a demand for a greater Nagaland comprising the contiguous Naga areas of states like Manipur, Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, I don't believe the Ao and Angami are very enthusiastic about following up on that demand, since that will bring Tankuls into the political calculus. Muiva, one of the key leaders of the Naga underground, is a Tankul, as are many other top commanders of the Naga underground. I myself am from Toloi, which as you can see is on that ridge, he concluded. This is just to give you a sense of a flavor of the kind of, surreality.
Thank you. I'd just quickly move the conversation to the future, because I think if we have to kind of, do a better job of building bridges, I think there has to be a different approach or a different strategy really, both that covers governance as well as other, ways of kind of assimilating the people. Sudeep, you also talked about the why this is going to be so crucial, keeping in mind the geopolitics of the region as well. Myanmar is opened up, that offers a big opportunity for India at one level, but unless we can kind of stabilize and the situation in the northeast, particularly in Arunachal, and the kind of perceived threats that we see from across the border in China, combined with the kind of environmental concerns that a lot of people have addressed because of what's going on with the glaciers, the Himalayan glaciers, and the possibility of water shortages. What is the scenario for the future? Could you kind of offer some perspective on that?
Well, we'll spend the next 2 days if I begin, and choose to not end. But let me just be very, very brief on this because it's a really vast topic. Let me flag a few thoughts and share them with you because I think we just have time for that. One is that I believe this will be of greater interest as we go ahead. Let me begin by saying that I believe that when I say we, I am again presuming to speak on behalf of the government of India, which I'm no part of, I want to clarify, is that it's finally woken up, the rhetoric is finally moving from being paranoid to engaging the people. I think it's moving towards some sort of resolution. It's being driven by a fatigue of conflict from the government of India's perspective, as well as the perspective of the governments in the Northeast, several governments in the Northeast, and especially driven by the people of the Northeast. So I think that resolution is coming, it's a few years away yet, but there is a realization that we need to now move ahead and tie loose ends and move on, because this is the geography that is the bridge to southwestern China and southern China. This is the geography that will be the bridge to Myanmar, which is the next big thing in Southeast Asia and South Asia, if you want to claim it that far. This geography is going to be the next big thing as it's adjacent to Bangladesh, and if we ever hope to develop the East, we cannot but again reclaim the link that was lost after 1947, where you could go from Agartala in Tripura to Kolkata in the span of a day, but now you have to spend 3 or 4 days to go all the way around. So these are various sort of dynamics that have come into play, which benefit India, which benefit Myanmar, which I hope to a great extent will benefit Bangladesh as well. So there is a process, policy process that's kicked in to move this ahead. There is also the realization that energy reserves in the northeast of India, not just in Assam, but in parts of Nagaland, in parts of Manipur and in Mizoram, and also the newfound, and so not newfound, but newly developed energy resources in Myanmar are critical to develop for our part of the world. And India has woken up to these sort of geo-economic parameters, if you will, in order to try and bring peace to this region. Number 3, I believe the ball has got rolling where the government of India in its superstructure has moved from being paranoid about various insurgencies or rebellions in the northeast to being paranoid about China in a way. So that is reflected, taking the reflection from conflicts, localized conflicts, into this sort of keeping China at bay kind of paranoia, if you will. To some extent that is helpful for the northeast because finally it's been taken seriously as a bulwark against China or China's influence. So I bring to you very sort of realpolitik needs and situations which even in a cynical perspective might drive government policy to the betterment of the people and the betterment of the people in the northeast, let alone the people from the northeast themselves. So I see this region to be in a fair amount of churn going ahead, and I sincerely believe that the people of the northeast have had enough of conflict. This is my personal conviction, and I believe that the people of the northeast, driven by the women of the northeast, will bring peace. If at all anybody brings peace, it will be the women of the northeast. I think we're looking at situations where this must go ahead. The downside to this is I fear the demographic element which Mr. Balagopal referred to early on in enumeration factors in Assam and so on and so forth. If the situation of aliens coming into the northeast is allowed to go out of hand and is not treated sensitively, and the local people's sentiments are not paid attention to in Manipur, Nagaland, Tripura, Mizoram, Assam and Meghalaya, then we will see a resurgence of the identity issues, the religious conflicts and other being misrepresented or being mistreated surface all over again. And if that happens, God help the Republic of India, and not even God.
Thank you, Sudeep, for your